Well, our next topic is Dualist Society. Uh, in this topic, first of all, we have to talk about the status of Hungary, of course. This is the date we should remember about the dualist era. Started with the compromise in 1867 and ended with the end of the First World War. So between these years, Hungary and Austria were united into a dualist monarchy. And now we are going to focus on society. But first of all, let's see the status. Well, of course, as I told you, the compromise set the two countries into Austro-Hungarian monarchy. It had two centers, Vienna and Budapest. Of course, we are going to focus on Budapest and Hungary. Franz Joseph was the king and Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, and Count Gyula Andrássy was the prime minister, the first prime minister of this dualist era. We also have to remember that the multi-ethnic country it was, because it had a real diverse society. We had a lot of ethnic minorities and nationalities, so we also have to talk about them if we are talking about society. But first of all, we have to remember that this society was something new. This is called a complex society in the dualist era. How can it be? It is complex or mingled society. Both are correct, so you can use both terms. First of all, we are at the end of the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution arrived in Hungary. The first and the second wave of the Industrial Revolution arrived together. So there was fantastic development economically, and urbanization speeded up. A lot of factories were opened in the big cities, mostly of course in Budapest, and it became a Western type of metropolis, I mean the capital city. But there was a huge contrast between Budapest and the untouched countryside, because the countryside was not yet affected. Only the huge lands of the aristocracy were modernized. So there was the traditional society and the new civilian society lived, and this is why we call it a complex society. So 19th century, 18th century society met the modern civilian society that was formed in this era. New lifestyle and traditional thinking met. Let's go into details. We are going to speak about our traditional society, the agricultural society, and our new society, the industrial society. First, let's go into agricultural society. What does this mean? So we are talking about those layers who belong to the land. So they make a living of the land and they are connected to agriculture. These are many layers. Aristocracy on the top, of course they are the great landowners. There is nobility who have lands, but smaller lands, but they still have titles, so both of them have hereditary titles. And there is the peasantry, a huge layer of the society. I'm going to show you this picture several times, but first here. The social layers are like that. I would like you to neglect the céhes mesterek. We don't need them. Actually, they are disappearing and they don't have to do anything with the land. So this is a false layer. But on the left-hand side of the triangle, these are the layers which belong to the land. From the top, aristocracy, there is nobility, and there are the peasants with several layers of peasants. So first I'm going to speak about this part, the left wing of the society. I mean the people who belong to agriculture. The highest layer is aristocracy, as I told you. This is the leading layer of the society, and they are not very many, few hundred families. But to be able to understand, these families are actually like closed castes. So actually it's a closed society. You cannot meet them. They meet only each other. but all political power is in their hands. So for example, Gyula Andrássy belongs here, or a great name like the Aponyi family and the highest families like Széchenyi and such. These families belong to this layer. They have only the important positions in politics. They are very rich. As you see, 1/3 of Hungarian lands are in their hands. What do? In their lands, they had money to modernize. So actually, their lands became capitalist centers where they invested and modernized with machines, and they could hire the best experts, even from abroad. And at the same time, this layer, as being the political leaders, they knew that our economic development is very important, so they also invested in industry and trade. They lived luxurious life, they had fantastic palaces in the countryside, they had, of course, home education, so they could hire the best teachers for their children, they traveled around the world, and of course, their life was a pattern for other classes. Everyone wanted to resemble to them. So the nobility and the rich civilian, later the bourgeoisie, all wanted to be like them. The next layer I'm going to speak about is the genteel middle class. Look at here, genteel middle class number 1. Because this layer, genteel middle class, has two sides, but they somehow meet each other and somehow mix. The agricultural part we are going to speak about now, they are the nobility, and the other part is gentle middle class too, without title people, so they are civilian middle class. But first, we are going to speak about these nobles. They are the nobility with the smaller lands, but after the hard times, after the War of Independence, there was problematic for them because of the passive resistance against the system, the Bach system, for example. They didn't bear positions and they had no income at that time. And after the War of Independence, the compensation after the abolition of serfdom was very slow, so they had a lot of financial problems. They had no capital, so they couldn't modernize their lands, most of them. Of course, there are higher and lower parts of this type of people, but socially they are in the same level. So many of them lost a lot. But even in harder situations, they keep traditions. So these nobles really want to live as their grandfathers lived, so they kept traditions. Their pattern is aristocracy, as I have just said. Many of them look for offices in the cities. So many of them, for example, sold their lands and lived city life. This is how they became middle class. They had residences in towns, and the lowest layer of them is called the gentry. The gentry is not like in England. It has a different meaning in Hungary. In England, the gentry is a positive word. They are the capitalist nobles who invested a lot. But in Hungary, here, gentry means the poor noble who lost everything but still keeps tradition, and they are often mocked by writers like Móricz Zsigmond, for example, because they were typical of the age. They lived in Budapest and they spent a lot of money, but actually they were only in lack of money. The other layers are still jealous for their lifestyle, so they are still a pattern for lower layers or civilian middle class. Let's go on to the peasants. Peasantry is the majority of the society, so we can say that the biggest part of Hungarian society is peasantry. There are several layers of peasantry. There are rich peasants who actually the leaders of the villages, but there are smaller land peasants and poor peasants. The poorest layer is the agrarian proletars. They are landless kotars, zsellérek, who have no land, but they are trying to make a living of seasonal jobs, and many times they are hired by the rich peasants because they have money to hire workers on their land. Sometimes a rich peasant is as rich as a lower noble, but actually they don't have titles. So peasantry is a layered society, but they have no political rights. And I also want to mention the manorial servants who are of peasant origin, but they are special class because they work at huge manors of the aristocracy. So the aristocrats hired these people to uh, um, to lead and help the functioning of their manor, their palaces. They help in everyday life, help in cooking and cleaning the palaces. So their living condition really depended on the owner of the palace. So they are not working on the fields, they are serving. But many times they had better living conditions than many others because they lived in a fantastic palace, of course. Going on to uh, going on to the industrial society. So industrial society means that this is a new social layer and they made a living of industry and they are connected to industry or they lived in the cities. Their life connected to towns, so they are an urbanized society. This is a growing layer because many peasants started finding a living in the cities. And of course, as their number is growing, the agrarians are decreasing. Um, their appearance is connected to Industrial Revolution, of course. Now we are going to speak about them to the right. They are the new society which belong to the Industrial Revolution. So this is the right wing. Let's go on. The highest layer is the bourgeoisie. This is a French word meaning the highest civilian class. As wealthy as aristocracy, they are actually factory or bank owners, like Gans Abraham, for example, the Gans factory, or Weiss Manfred, the Weiss factory owner. There are others as well, but these we have mentioned. They are huge investors. They invested huge money in businesses, but they have no titles. Of course, they want to be like the aristocrats, so later they had the right to buy titles. So they bought titles, they became aristocrats. But actually, originally they were not. They made business with aristocracy. This was also a closed caste, so they cannot be met anywhere. They spent a lot of money uh, on their high lifestyle, and they also bought their palaces like the aristocrats, but they also had residences in the city. Sometimes the aristocrats also had residences in the city. They also bought the best education for their children and traveled a lot, but they are not Hungarian families. Most of them are of German or Jewish origin, but their assimilation was successful. Assimilation is a key word in society, in dualist society, because assimilation means that a given layer could uh, fit in the Hungarian society. Well, they could. The gentle middle class second part under them, here as I told you, the middle class civilian part. So they are civilian origin, they don't have titles, but they are an educated layer, mostly of course Jewish or German people, doctors, teachers, lawyers, and they want to live a lifestyle like the nobility. So this is why the nobility's lifestyle is really interesting for them. They want to resemble. They live in welfare, they live in urban life. There is also a lower middle class, so we are talking about this lower middle class. This means that they are shopkeepers, employers and employees too. For example, if someone had a barber shop and they had some employees, they belong to the lower middle class. But of course, they don't have connections with the higher ones. Okay, so this is also a layered social life, society. And let's go to the masses of the city poor, because we are going to speak about the working class. They are only employees. This means they worked in companies, factories. Those who were experts in a given profession, they were wealthier, they were skilled, mostly Germans or Czechs, but Hungarian peasants who became industrial workers were unskilled factory workers. This was the majority of them. This is a growing social layer, and of course the poor layer lived in blocks, very poor living conditions in the cities. So these are the social classes we must remember in the dualist era. Now I'm going to speak about the ethnic minorities and nationalities because they also fitted into these social layers, but most of them were peasants or industrial workers. So the ethnic minorities. Well, in the dualist era, Hungarians got about 54% of society, so their absolute majority was regained after the 18th century. Of course, nationalities problems had to be solved because earlier Hungarians only believed that there were two nations in Hungary. There was Hungarians and Croatians, but there were a lot of other nationalities, so after the compromise, something had to be done with them. There were nationalist movements at that time, and they were banned by the Hungarian society. So laws got stricter and stricter as time passed. First, the law on ethnic minority was given out in 1868 by Eötvös József, which gave a lot of rights, their individual rights to the people, so there was equality before the law and they could have their own education. But as time passed, at the beginning of 20th century, 1907, the Lex Apponyi, this law was given out which said there was compulsory language learning for all the ethnic minorities, I mean Hungarian language. So we can say as time passed, there was forced assimilation of ethnic minorities in Hungary, but it was not successful. It was only successful with the rich Jews and Germans who could live in the cities and they had a good living condition, so they assimilated easily to the Hungarians. This is why, and of course the problems of the lower layers, a lot of people emigrated to the USA and to the West, about 1.5 million people. That's a lot of working force. This was, the title means Law on Ethnic Minorities. I'm going to speak about this law because it was important. As I told you, it was given out in 1868 by Eötvös József. It had liberal spirit, really modern at that time. They could use their mother tongues and education, administration on their own language, and they could have their native associations, but they had no territorial autonomy. All of them at that time already wanted territorial autonomy, but it was impossible. Hungarians didn't let it happen. So they had no collective rights, only individual rights, and that was quite modern, but it was not enough for these people. So, oh yes, it is written here, this was not enough for the nationalities. They wanted nation states. Of course, we can say that nation states were formed around Hungary. There was Romania, there was Serbia to the south, and there were, for example, Bosnians. But in the beginning of the 20th century, of course, the territorial problems led to the First World War. And that is all we have to know about the dualist society and the ethnic minorities.